Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We are picking up our study again in the book of Genesis. We're picking up where we left off last time, and tonight Colton is going to start us off with our study. And so, Colton, why don't you talk about what we're going to be looking at this evening?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about at least a bulk of the life of Jacob. Of course, there's some overlap. We have already talked about Jacob to some extent, and we're going to be still talking about Jacob next week as we focus a little bit more on his sons. But today we are going to be looking at perhaps the bulk of Jacob's life that we have record of, at least. And as we lead into that discussion, we're going to be starting around chapter 28. But we want to back up just a little bit to chapter 27. And in chapter 27, the last few verses, what you have there is the idea of the reasoning why Jacob was fleeing from his family and from the land of promise. Esau is jealous of his brother and wants to kill him. And this is very much like the story of Cain and Abel in that regard. There is some dissension between the two brothers. And at hearing that Esau is so jealous that he wants to kill him, Rachel sends Jacob away to Laban in order to help cool things off, at least for a time. And she uses Esau's foolish marital decisions to convince Isaac to send Jacob away to Laban as well, sending him off to marry in the family, if you will, and not mix with foreigners in the relationships that they would cause them to be led into idolatrous type practices. And so she sends him away to Laban, who is her brother. We'll have more to say about Laban later on in the lesson. But as we come into chapter 28, we see a discussion of what is taking place as he is traveling to the land of Laban. Isaac, once again, in faith, blesses Jacob, but this time sending him to Laban to marry along sending him to marry with those that are in Laban's family. And he also sends him away directly blessing him with the promises of Abraham. And this has been consistent in the book of Genesis. That the promises of Abraham were passed on to Isaac, and then they are passed from Isaac to Jacob. And he gives them, again, the same promises that you see that were given to Abraham in the beginning, at least in part. But God is actually going to do the same thing later on in the story. And so in response to seeing that Isaac did not want Jacob to be married to Canaanites, Esau then goes and he marries in the family, again, if you will, and marries in the family of Ishmael. But this doesn't really fix the problem that was with his Canaanite wives. It just adds to the issue that is taking place here, or adding to the harem, if you will. So on the way to Haran, as Jacob is on his way there, Jacob takes a stone. He puts his head down to rest, and in his dreams, he sees angels ascending and descending on this ladder. We even have just a very common term talking about Jacob's ladder, but as well, we're very familiar with that terminology, but it comes from this story where there is this vision, this dream that Jacob is having of these angels ascending and descending. And it is clarified what God is doing here. And though it is clarified, this is shown to represent to Jacob that God is with him and he will bless him. And in fact, a song that we sing, Nearer My God to Thee, is based off of this story. And you can kind of hear the terminology. My rest a stone, Bethel I raise. In my dreams, I'd be nearer my God to thee. And you have that this story is emphasized in the idea that God is drawing closer in a relationship with Jacob. And so this shows that Jacob is not just the foolish trickster or cheater that we might think earlier on in the story, that he actually does have a relationship with God in faith, and God wants to bless him and is pleased with him in some way. Again, based off of this story. And so he blesses him, and like Isaac just did, God promises the same to Jacob as he did to Abraham and Isaac, that he would bless him with the land promise, the nation promise, and the seed promise. It is passed on to this son of Isaac. And through all of his life, he promises that he will be with Jacob and promise to keep this covenant with him. Now, where there's perhaps a relationship of this passage with the New Testament is in John chapter 1 and verses 47 through 51. And you have there a story that is really obscure when you actually think in the context of all the Gospels. This is the only time that you see this story in particular, but it's when Jesus sees Nathanael coming and he says, "Behold, an Israelite indeed." And so it kind of ties back to that we're talking about Israel here, but the connection is even further established when Nathanael said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." And he says, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. Truly I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." The connection that is being made here is the idea that Jesus is the Jacob that we've been waiting for. The same relationship that God wanted to have with Jacob, who is later going to be called Israel, so he is, if you will, an Israelite indeed. You have that the connection is made that Jesus is the true Israel. That relationship that God wanted to have with Jacob, which he promised to have with Jacob, is fulfilled in Jesus. And so, in which case, if we want to have a relationship with God of the same caliber as Israel, if you will, both physically and spiritually, then we have to have a relationship with Jesus himself, because he is the one to follow so that we can be a part of that spiritual Israel. And so Jacob recognizes that his meeting with the divine presence has taken place, and he honors God in this passage by building an altar and naming it the house of God, or Bethel. And this later is actually where it's possible that the tabernacle resided for a short time, but then later was corrupted by idolatrous temples, a house of God, if you will, but of course, a corrupted house of God. But verses 20 through 22, he talks about here that this is, if God will bless me, then I will do this and give a 10th portion. I want to be clear here that this is not him placing conditions on God, but this was very common covenant language that was given. If this is what's going to be done for me, then this is what I'm going to do for God, an eager giving back to God based on what he has given him. And so that leads us into chapter 29, where we're more familiar with the Jacob story, perhaps. And Marshall, if you'll take it from there.
Sure. So following these events at Bethel, Jacob makes the 400+ mile journey to Haran, and that journey could have taken 2 to 4 weeks to complete, depending on what path he took and how fast he walked. But when Jacob arrived at the communal well there, he inquired of the local shepherds concerning Laban, his uncle. And at that very moment, coincidentally, Rachel, the daughter of Laban, comes to the well in order to water the flocks of her father. Jacob joyfully greets Rachel, and later, just after that, greets Laban and stays with them for a month, working for Laban, seemingly free of charge. And Laban sees the problem here, and he offers to pay Jacob for his time, even though he's a relative. He's not going to take his labor for free. And so Jacob states the conditions of his wage. He says, here's what I want. I want Rachel's hand in marriage for the labor that I give to you. And Laban agrees. We'll put that in quotes. And Jacob serves Laban for 7 years. Now, this should show us that the dowry was not cheap. So regardless of what liberal feminist scholars claim, women in the Bible were not always just thrown around like property. They were valued. And furthermore, when you get to Genesis 29 and verse 20, it's probably one of the most romantic passages in Scripture, where Jacob loved Rachel, and it seemed like those 7 years were but nothing because of the love that he had for her. Now, as the story progresses, you get to the conflict where Laban actually has 2 daughters, not just Rachel, but also Leah. And Jacob has chosen Rachel, even though she is the younger of the 2. And why does he do this? Well, the Bible seemingly points out that it's because he is physically attracted to her, that Rachel is beautiful in form and in face. And it says that Leah's eyes are weak. At least that's how the New American Standard Bible translates it. And what does that mean, that Leah's eyes were weak? I'm not 100% sure what that involves. But the Hebrew word there, rachot, is a word that can have both positive and negative connotations. And it's so translated in different English Bibles. Um, it could be that Leah's weak eyes meant that they did not have sparkle, or maybe they were weary with tears, or it could be that Leah was had lovely or attractive eyes, that is delicate or tender. And so the ambiguity means that Leah's best or worst trait were her eyes. And sadly, Jacob is seemingly allured by the physical beauty, at least at first, resulting in the heartbreak of Leah and conflict between the sisters. Now, why does that conflict arise? Well, it arises primarily because Laban tricks Jacob into marrying Leah before Rachel. Even though Jacob has worked for 7 years, and the agreement was 7 years and you can marry Rachel, at the last minute, on the wedding night, the two brides are switched. And Laban, possibly Leah, not sure how much she was involved in the conspiracy, but this is unbeknownst to Jacob, and he is ignorant of it until the next morning. How was he ignorant? Well, it could be one, that Leah was wearing a veil that would have probably been customary, or it could have been, if the eyes of Leah are the weak part of her attractiveness, that she and her sister are not too different except for the weak eyes that make her unattractive. Or one interpretation that I do not like, because it's arguing from silence and it puts Jacob in a very bad light, is to say that he was drunk and didn't realize. But that is just a complete argument from silence. So regardless, the point of the story is that the deceiver, Jacob, gets a taste of his own medicine. Now, Colton's already pointed out that Jacob does have faith, but in this story, we're seeing a transformation of Jacob. He is moving toward greater faith and greater morality, as it were. And I would say that this deception is a learning, is a point in which God is helping teach Jacob just what his old life has done and where he needs to move in the future. And so Jacob was given Rachel as well after the customary week given to Leah, and on the condition that he would work for Laban for an additional 7 years. But from here, the conflict grows because, verse 30, Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Now this partiality among his wives is going to then transfer to his sons, and this family is going to be split down the middle. It's going to result in some terrible conflict. Now, because Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, it seems that God pities Leah and allows her to have children, whereas it specifically says in Scripture that Rachel was barren, at least at the first part of their marriage. And so the rest of Genesis 29 and the first part of Genesis 30 describe the growth of Jacob's family. This would have also provided the tribes of Israel with their quote-unquote origin story, as it were. And so Leah bears Reuben first, and Reuben is actually a combination of two Hebrew words that means look, a son. And so firstborn Reuben is born, and in that birth story, you can just hear the hurt in Leah's voice. Quote, "Surely now my husband will love me." Genesis 29:32. She then has Simeon, which means heard, because the Lord had heard. Levi, meaning attached, because she believes now her husband will be attached. Now this time my husband will become attached to me, verse 34. And then she bears Judah, which is related to the word for praise, and she praises Yahweh. And so it's interesting that in almost all of these scenarios where she's naming her children, she gives the glory to the Lord, all caps, Yahweh, Jehovah. And in this, she finally comes to a point where she says, praise the Lord, in Judah. And Judah's genealogy, as it follows, is really going to be truly an act of praise toward God. Now Rachel becomes jealous and blames Jacob for her infertility, and she therefore gives her handmaid Bilhah to Jacob as wife. And Dan and Naphtali are born to this union. Dan meaning vindicated, Naphtali meaning wrestling. And you can read the text to find out all the story there. But there's more. Leah gets jealous and gives her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob. And Zilpah bears Gad, which means fortunate, and Asher, which means happy. And if this sounds crazy to you, it only gets worse, because Reuben finds mandrakes in the field, and mandrakes are mentioned only 2 times in Scripture, here in Genesis 30 and also in Song of Solomon 7. And the ancient world seemingly superstitiously believed that this plant would increase fertility. And so therefore, what does Rachel do? Wanting to have children of her own, she trades a night of intimacy with Jacob to Leah for the mandrakes. And that night, Leah conceives and has Issachar, which means wages. And so next, Leah bears Zebulun, which means honor. The New American Standard Version kind of misses the wordplay there and says, now my husband will dwell with me. ESV is probably better there. Now my husband will honor me. And again, this is the somewhat pitiable situation of Leah, the unloved wife. And you hear in her words, now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. And yet seemingly Rachel is still the favorite. Leah also bears Jacob a daughter, Dinah, and she comes up a little bit later in the story. We'll see that later in our study. But Rachel is not forgotten by God. He allows her to conceive her first son, Joseph, which is related to the Hebrew for taken away, because God has taken away her reproach. But then it also is connected to the idea of add. And so may God add another son. That's translated give in the New American Standard Bible. And so with the birth of Joseph, Jacob is wanting to return to the land of Canaan. And so let me hand it off there to Stephen as we kind of see that drive to go back to Canaan, but he's going to stay in Mesopotamia for a little longer.
Real quick before we hand it off, just as a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions or comments that you want to add, put those in the bar below, and we'll try to get to those questions best we can.
Yeah. So picking up from there, Jacob has been working all this time for Laban while his family is growing. And he comes to a point here in chapter 30, about midway through chapter 30, that he comes to Laban and he says, it's time for me to go make my own fortune and really provide for my family. And it looks like Laban recognizes the blessings that he has enjoyed since Jacob has come. I think what we see is evidence of that promise that was made to Abraham and then handed down to Isaac and now Jacob, that I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. It is a blessing to be around Abraham and his children. And so Laban is enjoying, even though he's not been maybe as friendly as he ought to be, he's still enjoying the blessings of just being near Jacob. Jacob points that out. He says, you've grown. And it seems like that as Laban has prospered because of Jacob's presence, he's not sharing that prosperity with Jacob in equal portion. And so Jacob is ready to go and separate. Laban does not want him to leave, obviously, because things are going well with Jacob's presence. He says, name your wages. And at this point, Jacob does an interesting thing. I think there's something, again, we're seeing the growth. There's something of trust in God here, but there's also a little bit of the schemer still there. And so what he does is he says, essentially, I'll take the lambs that would be less desirable, and the speckled and the spotted, and basically the ones that don't have a uniform wool and so forth. And so he would take all of those. And you can see Laban likes that idea. And he puts 3 days separation between himself and Jacob. He's gonna make sure that none of that stock mixes with his stock. Well, what happens is, though they may not have the features that would be the most desirable, they end up being the healthiest, and all of those that Jacob that are produced in Jacob's flock are very strong, and the ones in Laban's flock are weaker. Now, I don't think that is to say that Laban doesn't prosper. it just is a moment where God tilts the scale through providence. I think you can see that through the story here. Through providence, tilts that scale in Jacob's direction so that he prospers even more. Now, as you continue on, there's another element where Jacob is putting sticks in front of the lambs that are his, and so they're producing the strong. He puts a stick, and so they end up producing lambs that will be his because of the way that they turn out. And again, God's providence. Putting sticks in front of lambs doesn't do anything outside of God's care there, and so there seems to be some element. There certainly seems to be some element of God's provision there. Well, things continue on apace until finally Jacob is certainly ready to go, and he tells his wives about that. And you see how far Laban's mistreatment has gone, till his daughters even say, "Yes, let's get out of here." I mean, they realize we're not going to prosper here. They're not. There's no pushback, and so they all break camp and they begin to leave Laban at that point. So as they're leaving, they leave while Laban is away so that they can get a good head start. And they're headed down the path, and Laban comes back, and when he returns, he sees that they're gone, and so he's going to pursue them. And of course, Jacob with a large family and no doubt servants and so forth, they're traveling at a much slower pace than Laban and his caravan would travel. And so they catch up to them. And one of the things that happens here, very interesting, is that Laban says, you took my household gods when you left. And of course, Jacob doesn't know about this. And so he says, no, we didn't. Well, it just so happens that Rachel did do just that, take the household gods. Later, we're going to see that they put those away, but at this moment, she's still clinging to those. And that's interesting because, remember, Jacob was sent up there to keep away from the idolatry of Canaan, and yet there's idolatry there as well. Well, Rachel schemes so that her father doesn't find the household idols, and there's a covenant made between Jacob and Laban, and the covenant it's pretty strong language between a man and his father-in-law, and it's basically there's a line in the sand that's drawn, and the word to Laban, who incidentally was visited by God and was told. Was warned by God not to harm Jacob. The covenant is, don't come across this line with an intent to do harm. And I will not come across that line with an intent to do harm. And really, it seems that the result of that is, don't cross the line. You don't come here, I won't come there, and we'll go our separate ways. So, that brings us into chapter 32, where as soon as Jacob is saying goodbye to this threat over here, and the mistreatment that he suffered at the hands of his father-in-law, he turns around and he sees his brother coming, and so there's fear there, because that's the reason he fled in the first place, is that he heard his brother was going to try to take his life. And so as we pick up there, Colton, why don't you tell us about that meeting and what led up to it?
So we do have this brief account in verses 1 and 2 that says, "Now as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. Jacob said when he saw them, 'This is God's camp.' So he named that place Mahanaim." And this is kind of a short story that there's not really a lot of clarification as to what's going on here, but it's very possible, because of what the word Mahanaim means, that this is perhaps key to understanding the next couple of chapters, because the word Mahanaim means two camps. Now, in this context, it has the idea of that there is a spiritual camp of God that must have been here since the angels approach him, and then there's Jacob's camp himself. But as Stephen was just mentioning, he's approaching Esau in this story. And so there are two physical camps that are approaching one another. And there is a meeting that is going to happen between those two, just like there is this meeting that is especially going to happen in this narrative, in this couple of chapters, between the camp of Jacob and the camp of God as they meet together once again, just in the same way that they met earlier on with Jacob's ladder. And so this is perhaps a key to understanding the rest of this passage. Jacob sends messengers to Esau and he pleads mercy from Esau, and they return with the news that Esau is coming, and he's coming with an army. And this is not something that is, of course, encouraging to Jacob. This is not the response that he was looking for. And we later find out that it was perhaps misconstrued. But in order to protect his family for the coming onslaught that he's expecting, he divides into two companies, again, two camps. And he thanks God for all that he has given him and asks for God's protection. So you see this faith that he puts in God, this trust that he puts in God, that he will protect him, but he takes some precautionary measures as well in order to protect his family. Jacob then starts to send great gifts. He goes in a full procession, sending drove after drove of gifts to Esau in order to placate any residual wrath that he was expecting to receive from his brother. If we didn't mention this exactly, but whenever his mother sent him away, she actually said, "I will send for you whenever things cool off," basically. And since he never heard word back from, he probably still thinks that there is some animosity between him and his brother. But after he sends these gifts, he finds himself alone again one night. And this is perhaps like he had done earlier in this same chapter. This is perhaps to pray more concerning the situation, ask God for blessing and protection concerning this situation. And then this man, whoever it may be, begins to wrestle with him. And we're not told who this is initially. And perhaps we see that even Jacob doesn't know who it is initially. And that maybe lends it toward that perhaps Jacob had it in his mind that this is Esau and he's come to kill him. And so he's wrestling with his brother and he better win this fight, otherwise he's going to be killed. Or maybe he does know who this is. And the reason perhaps he does is because he requests specifically a blessing from him. Whenever you have the idea of someone blessing someone else, typically, except for a couple of exceptions, typically you have that it is a blessing from God. So perhaps he knows that this is an angel or maybe even Yahweh himself that is wrestling with him on this occasion. And he says, "What is your name?" And he says, "My name is Jacob." He says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but instead your name will be Israel, because you have striven with God and prevailed." And this becomes perhaps a double meaning that's happening here. The idea of strives with, you have that he literally wrestled against God. And then it could mean as well the idea of that he has fights with God on a spiritual level. And the idea of prevails could have a double meaning as well, that you have that he won the match here, or it could mean that he prevails by finding favor with God through the blessings that is given to him. And this is often the relationship you see between God and the nation of Israel, that they are in a constant fight with God often because of their sin, but the double meaning is true as well, that they're often fighting with God also. And so you have that they are often striving even not just against God, but they are striving with God in order to have a better relationship with him. And so you see this name being played out throughout the nation of Israel, and not only in Jacob's life alone. But in the end, Israel prevails by finding blessings from God. And of course, this being through the ultimate fulfillment of the promise Jesus himself. And so Israel's fulfillment of its very name is found in our Lord. Now, a question that may arise is this the angel of the Lord, which Marshall talked about a couple of weeks ago, that could be even Yahweh himself. We're not told here, but Jacob saw this as some heavenly or divine encounter either way. And so what he does is he honors God in this account. And then it goes back to the story of him approaching Esau. And he divides into companies. And this seems to, he seems to set up the situation in order of favoritism. Because in the first drove that he sends, the first company that he sends is the children of the concubines. And then in the second drove, behind them are the children of Leah. And then in the third drove is Rachel and Joseph. And so there is an order of protection, perhaps, that we'll send the children I maybe don't care as much about, till finally we get to Joseph, who is his, of course, favorite, which we'll talk about here more in just a moment. But instead of wrath, Jacob finds instead mercy and favor from Esau, and he pleads that Jacob will stay with him. Now, that doesn't wind up happening, but the relationship is restored, and that's more than we can say for the future of the two nations that arise from them, but Esau at least found, or was merciful to his brother. We do see that Jacob here buys another piece of the promised land at the end of chapter 33, and he buys it from Hamor and worshiped God over all that had occurred in his life up until this point, and especially in God bringing him home. But that purchase of land from Hamor actually leads us into our next section of text, and I'll hand that over to Marshall, chapters 34 and 35.
So you have here the story of Hamor's son, Shechem, and the story of Dinah. Now, just mentioned Dinah in previous chapters as she was a daughter of Leah. And that's about all that has been said up to this point. But now we have kind of a big picture idea that would be important for the Israelites to read, the original readers, but then is also, of course, part of this history of the problem of intermarriage and defilement with the Canaanites. And that recurring motif not only occurs in Genesis, but also as you track through the rest of the law, the history books of Israel. And so God had prevented the Egyptians and the Philistines from taking Sarah, defiling the seed. The same could be said with with Rebekah, and Isaac and Rebekah had sent Jacob to their relatives to prevent intermarriage with the Canaanites. And now the story of Dinah and Shechem continues the same idea. Genesis 34 is sometimes labeled the rape of Dinah, is a case of seduction, consensual fornication rather than rape. Excuse me for just a second. I'm noticing.
Yeah, just a little bit of lag going on. It's maybe catching up a little bit. But.
Yep. Let me just make sure that it reconnects. It looks like it's trying to reconnect. It says we're having trouble playing this time. Let me see if it comes up. Sorry about this, everyone. If you're still on there, hearing audio or anything. Shows that I've got a good connection on my side, so I'm not sure why we're having.
I'm still seeing it in the Facebook feed, so.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. All right, so it's showing on my end that it's at least connecting, if not already connected. So we'll continue on just in hopes that it's still there. Maybe Colton or Stephen, if you're able to look in
the YouTube connection's
up. Online.
Yeah, the YouTube connection's up in the Facebook as well. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so rather than this being a case of fornication, I ran this by Colton and Stephen as well, and they lean in the same direction. But when you translate Genesis 34 and verse 2, literally it says, Shechem saw her and took her and lay with her and humbled her. Now that last phrase, humbled her, is sometimes translated defiled or raped. And that same expression is used in Deuteronomy to describe adultery and fornication. Look at chapters Deuteronomy 22, 24, and 29. But you can also contrast that with an actual rape that does occur in the same phrase in 2 Samuel 13, 14. But regardless, the focus of the story is actually on the violence of Jacob's sons rather than on the rape or, in my thinking, the fornication, defilement of Dinah. After Shechem takes Dinah, he wants to marry her. And the sons of Jacob, they strike a deceitful bargain, offer to intermarry with the Israelites if Dinah is given to Shechem. And the sons of Israel said they will make this covenant if the men of the city will circumcise themselves. Well, the men of the city see all the wealth of Jacob and his family. They say, hey, if we intermarry, it's all going to be ours. And so on the third day, after circumcising themselves, still in pain, abiding by the terms of the covenant, Jacob and Simeon come in and break the covenant in that they enter the city, kill all the men, and loot their property. Jacob's response to that, now the Canaanites and the Perizzites are going to hate me because of you. Simeon and Levi's response, look what they did to Dinah. So obviously the holy seed needs some work, and hence the law is going to come a little bit later to try to set some of these things in order. But the treachery of Simeon and Levi excludes them from the royal messianic prophecy or promises of Jacob. And we'll examine those next week. Moreover, in this same chapter, the immorality of Reuben, verse 35:22, excludes him. He sleeps with his father's wife, father's concubine. And the next son in line is Judah. And as you track that through the Old Testament story on into the New Testament story, Jesus is born of Judah. And the royal line does come from Judah. You have Judah, David, Jesus as the key characters in these messianic promises. Yet even Judah is going to have to overcome issues of immorality. We'll see that with Tamar next week, and treachery. We'll see that with Judah and Joseph next week, before he is qualified to serve as the progenitor of Christ. And so we'll discuss all those things more next week. But speaking of change in character, I think the climax of Jacob's spiritual transformation occurs in Genesis 35. God directs Jacob to depart from Shechem and to dwell in Bethel, the place where Jacob first met God. There, Jacob commands his family to remove idolatry from their tents. Colton alluded to that earlier. He also tells them, sanctify yourselves and represent that by a change of clothing. And then we are going to worship God on an altar that I build. And amazingly, beautifully, the family follows his lead. Just throw in a side point. When fathers lead spiritually, it can have a drastic effect on the family. And so these idolaters change and follow their father into worship of the one and true living God. And you see that they even go as far as removing their jewelry, which could represent some kind of idolatrous jewelry, or maybe some have speculated it was taken from Shechem. But just compare that to Hosea 2:13 sometime on your own time. Hosea 2:13. And so God blesses Jacob here in this chapter. Just as he said he would bless, he changed the name, offered a blessing. Israel said, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. And then we have here a blessing. And that blessing is a representation or a renewal of his covenant, the Abrahamic promises that had been made for him. And protection continues, because as Jacob leaves, instead of the Canaanites and Perizzites coming on and destroying him, there's fear placed in their hearts. I think there was some divine providence in there, that they are not pursuing Jacob because of the fear that God has placed in their hearts, so that they do not follow Jacob and destroy him. And from this point onward, we might think everything's going good, and things are looking better spiritually, but we're going to see that things continue to still have a downward spiral in the family. Even though they follow his leadership in worship, there's still that partiality that causes difficulties. And the end of this section is going to have several deaths listed. You've got Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, who is specifically mentioned as passing away in 35:8. You have Rachel dying in verse 19. You have Isaac dying in verse number 29. Now, some have speculated that Jacob had grown to love Leah more than Rachel, and though Rachel is not buried in the family tomb, Jacob still seems to show her honor in her death and seems to prefer her children to the others. And so we'll see that play out in the rest of the story and on into next week. But in the midst of these deaths, several important events occur. Again, one, God confirms the name change of Jacob to Israel and his inheritance of the Abrahamic covenant. Two, Benjamin, or as his mother calls him, Ben Oni, son of my sorrow. Benjamin, meaning son of my right hand, is the name that his father gives him. He's born, thus completing the 12, which leads to third, this official listing, as it were, of the sons of Israel. You move through the sons of Leah and the handmaids and Rachel, and here are the 12 sons. You have the finish of that origin story, if you will. Here are the 12 sons from which will come the 12 tribes from which the rest of the Old Testament is based on, leading into the new. Now, consequently, Genesis 36 quickly rehearses the genealogy of Esau. You kind of see that in the end of 35 with Israel or Jacob. Now we're going to see it in Esau. And so I'll hand that off to Stephen. I think you've got 36 and 37 to finish us off.
Yeah. Just real quickly to add a couple of comments. One was Kathy Mitchell pointed out. She said, I always found it interesting as far as the two sisters and the rivalry that Leah ends up being laid to rest with Jacob and Rachel being buried elsewhere. And it is, an interesting end to that story, a turnabout maybe. Another commenter noted this about the chapter 32 and the wrestling with God, Hosea chapter 12 puts it in that term, that he contended with God. Then it says yes, and he wrestled with the angel. And so if you're reading through Genesis 32 and you're saying, it doesn't say angel anywhere here, Hosea clarifies that for us. In fact, it goes on to clarify that he cried out to God with tears. And so as Jacob is crying out, there's just a little bit more flavor to the story there, that you get a sense of Jacob's demeanor in that interaction. So I recommend that as well, to look at Hosea chapter 12. Well, coming back to our text then at chapter 35, chapter 36 rather, we do see the genealogy of Esau. And I think one thing to note about this genealogy, as it goes through and it tells us who his sons are, and the numbers are large. I mean, we're given all sorts of paths for this tree as we get a sense of the grandness of his family already, that he already makes up a considerable company. That lines up with what we referenced just briefly last week, looking forward to Joshua, well past the time in Egypt, hundreds of years later, as Israel is coming into their land. God says, I long since gave Esau land, but I haven't given Israel land yet. You get a sense where Esau's already approaching that here in chapter 36, the size and so forth. And so a head start there, you might say. But at any rate, these names are listed out. You can see some of these names picked up as locations later on. And so they become rather important men with cities named after them, and so forth. Well, chapter 37, we sort of set Esau's story down. Here is his genealogy. Now let's come back to Jacob, and really we're going to stick with Jacob's family, particularly Joseph, for most of the rest of the text. Well, the story of Joseph really begins in chapter 37. We're told of his birth earlier, obviously. And his story is that of a beloved child, beloved more than all the rest of his brothers. He's beloved, and his father or his brothers know that he is loved more than they are. He doesn't just think it like most of us we all think that our parents love the other kids better. No, they were right. I mean, he didn't make he didn't make any sorts of pretense about this or subtlety. He even, many of you know, gave his son Joseph a coat to sort of inaugurate his favoritism, to communicate that favoritism. Incidentally, there's a favoritism perhaps in that his brothers are out working in the field, and he sends Joseph to go check on his brothers. Why isn't Joseph out there working with them? And so there's just many indicators of that favoritism. But then there's also the low character of the brothers. We've already touched on that. As we continue on in the story and the blessings come, this is going to be rehearsed by Jacob. He's going to go down the list and say, Reuben and Simeon and Levi, all three of these have in some way transgressed their father's will so that it comes down to Judah for that blessing. And so there is already proof and evidence of a willfulness and a low character. Well, Joseph goes and he brings back a bad report. And there's no indication. Some people might think that that Joseph is lying about his brothers. I would say a bad report would be consistent with what we've already seen and consistent with what we will see of these brothers. Well, that of course makes them angry. Then Joseph has dreams. He has a dream of sheaves of wheat bowing down to a singular, and he recognizes in the dream that he is the one that they are bowing down to. He tells his brothers about this. Some people look at this, and then he goes on to tell his parents about the next dream in which the stars are included in a very similar scene, but even the mother and father are represented in that scene. And the question is asked of Joseph, are we all going to worship you, or are we all going to serve you, and you going to rule over us? And some people think that what Joseph is doing is sort of bragging here. And this is just really, unbecoming of appropriate behavior. Well, I think a good question to ask is one that Marshall's asked, as we've talked about this before. If you had a revelation from God, what would you do? You would tell people. In fact, that's what people do throughout all the scriptures, is when they receive dreams and when they hear a revelation from God, they tell people. It was revealed to Moses that he was the humblest man who ever lived, and he wrote that down, presumably. And so that doesn't make Moses arrogant. In fact, quite the opposite. But here's Joseph telling a dream. And the fact is, the dream comes true. Joseph is set in a place of authority, and they do come bowing down before him as a ruler, really over the known world. And so there should be, there doesn't need to be that jealousy. Well, of course, the jealousy grows, and they say, what are we going to do about this brother of ours? And what they decide is they're going to kill him, but they stop short of that. They throw him into a pit. And they think about it, and they think, well, we could kill him, but we also could make some money here. And so what they do is they fish Joseph back out of the pit, and they go and sell him to Ishmaelites who are passing by, and they buy him as a slave, and they're going to take him on down to Egypt, and we'll pick up there in chapter 39 with him in Egypt. But then they take his coat, which is the prized possession, the evidence of his favor, and they dip it in animal's blood, and they bring that back to Jacob, and they show him that, and they don't say, here's what happened. They just show it to him, and Jacob says, my son has been killed. And they basically, let him go on in that belief. And so he will continue to live in that belief for many, many years. And it's going to scar Jacob in such a way that he really, interestingly, he doesn't learn about the favoritism. He goes on to favor Joseph's brother. and would continue down that path. But even though maybe Jacob doesn't grow from that experience, the brothers are going to grow. And we're going to see some of that as we continue on looking at the text. And at least somewhat, there's going to be some growth. And certainly Judah in particular, we're going to see some of that growth. But maybe the next chapter begins to set up the foundations. Like, we're going to see some growth in Judah, but first we're going to see some need for growth in Judah. And so we'll pick up there looking at that story next week. And so as we come to a close, guys, any comments that you guys have coming in or questions?
We're good over here.
Ryan made a comment, I presume talking about either the bad report or the vision, the dreams, that communicating those things in the correct manner makes all the difference. And we don't really know how Joseph communicated. It's from God. We need to make sure that we're doing things in love, speaking the truth in love. And so from what we know of the character of Joseph, though, I assume even though he was a young man, he probably showed great integrity. At least he's going to within the next couple of years of his life.
Yeah, and I just might point out that, of course, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen associates Joseph with a rejected Savior in a long line of rejected saviors or rejected messengers from God. And so he falls into, in the New Testament, falls into company, certainly beloved and honored company. And so I certainly think that our tone and everything has to be appropriate. I just also, would say that from the standpoint of Joseph's brothers, they're murderers, and or people who plot murder and sell their brother into slavery. They're not the ones I'm looking to for cues as to how, what's maybe Joseph's tone. I wouldn't. I would say Joseph's character would suggest that his approach would have been appropriate, or at least the consistency of his character would be in that direction, whereas the consistency of their character thus far would be quite the opposite. Marshall, you want to take us into what we're going to be looking at next week?
Yeah, and let me just throw one more thing out there on that point is, Joseph is going to be an amazing example for us here and in the future, in that even though he had a father who favored him, even though his mother died, even though his brothers hated him, he somehow turned out to be a godly person. And so he didn't use that as an excuse not to serve the Lord. And so we're going to see that next week. We'll finish Genesis next week. If you have some time, read Genesis 38 through 50 before our study next Tuesday. This section of scripture is going to focus on the life of Joseph. Secondary characters are going to be Judah, Jacob, Pharaoh, and a few others. But the real point of this last part of Genesis is to show that God has not forgotten his covenant with Abraham. And he's going to protect his people from famine, from foreign land. He's going to provide for them in Egypt. He's going to prepare to fulfill the promise to Abraham that his descendants will be a great nation. And so I hope that you'll join us as we finish out this great book of history, as we learn how God continues to fulfill his promises, which is really the thread that goes all the way through the Bible, leading us all the way to Jesus Christ. And so thank you all for being here. Did you fellas have any additional comments or questions on your end before we close out?
Just one more comment. Rachel Neely adds, it's interesting that Jacob's faith seems to be the strongest during the period of time when he is going through trials and uncertainty. And just the thought, do we let our trials grow our faith and build our dependency on God? And I think that's a great addition there. Well, all right. Well,
and that's a great point for us to end on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we look forward to next week and hope that you'll join us then. And we'll pick up in the next chapter 38, and go through the end of this book. And we we look forward to the opportunity to study with you again. Thanks for joining us.